Welcome to this edition of the High Strangeness Factor, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Tonight, we're going to do kind of a special show, or at least a different show. First, I want to introduce my co-host, Andy Mercer. Andy, welcome back.
Yes, it's good to be back again. It's trying to make it more regular, as I said before, and hopefully it's kind of been better than it had been sort of last year when I appeared once in about 3 or 4 months. Now I'm trying to be a bit more regularly. So yes, it's really good.
Well, we always have the challenge that, certain days aren't good for you. Me as a man of leisure, a retired man of leisure, I don't have that restriction so much. But also we have the time difference, 5 hours for you and me, and anybody as you continue west throughout the continent of the United States, it gets even a longer stretch. So we have to deal with that sometimes. But nevertheless, tonight we since we don't have a guest, we thought we would just chat, ramble. Because you and I, we talk a lot sometimes after the show or before the show, and we do have a lot of conversations over Facebook Messenger, and those are always fun. And this is kind of what we'll be doing tonight, the kind of stuff that people behind the scenes stuff people don't get to see, and there's no extra charge.
Yes. And they were wondering, perhaps telling people from the start there's no guest, I might have just straight away turned off.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, hell no. We're going to go watch the Paranormal Concept Show. To hell with you guys.
We're interviewing each other, I suppose, is one way of putting it. So we are each the other person's guest.
Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely. So what we talked about earlier, what we would start with, you had been watching the reality TV show called The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, and I have seen both. I have the first season on DVD. So in not too distant past, I watched the first episodes again, and I watched the episodes as they came out this past time. So now, keeping in mind, a lot of people, and rightly so, are very suspicious about anything called a reality show, because we've all heard, I know some people that have been on them, and I've heard horror stories about the stuff the producers want them to do and to fabricate and all that. So what was your takeaway from watching these? You saw both seasons, right?
Yes, I've watched now both of them. The second one, pretty much one after the other. I watched 8 episodes in one go, then the final 2 after, because it was just getting too late at night. I was falling asleep, and absolutely fascinating. One thing I will say quickly before is we'll try and make sure we don't spoil it for anybody who's not seen them yet. I'll just tell you a funny little story, just as a little side view of that. I'm a huge cricket fan, and English sport cricket, and we have long 5-day tests that run for 5 days, obviously, and they always have like a lunch break and a tea break, and often in the lunch break on the radio they have a guest on who will talk about whatever they're involved in. Often they're interested in cricket as well, but they usually have different people on, actors, sometimes politicians, movie stars, all those kind of people, writers. And the last England v India test a couple of weeks back, on the Saturday lunch break, they were going to be talking to an actor, a British actor who appeared in a series called Line of Duty, which had been very popular and successful, and I think it's done quite well in the States as well. And the guy who was doing the interview, John Stacey, said, I don't want to sort of spoil it for you, so a slight spoiler alert here that you might hear stuff about the program you may not know. And then he went on to introduce the guest and mentioned that the guest played the chief villain, who you only find out at the end who the villain is. So the whole thing was ruined. I've had a chance to get to the radio to turn it off, because I've not watched it. I might have done, but there's no point now, because I know who the baddie was. It's like, oh no, a slight spoiler. The whole thing was given away. So going to do our best, I think, to try and avoid saying anything that gives too much away about the show for those who haven't yet seen it. But if you haven't and you're into the paranormal, it's worth watching. As you rightly say, I've had a brief involvement in a couple of reality programs to do with the paranormal, and it isn't quite the world you think you're seeing. There's certainly things a little different. I'm showing up. I briefly appeared in the Tap. Taps, yeah. But I appeared in an episode that they
Ghost
did.
Hunters.
That's the one, yes. That's the one. Well, I was in, they basically they filmed an episode. I think it might have been two actually. One was at a place called the Hellfire Caves, which is in England, which I know rather well, and the second one was a place called the Viaduct Tavern, which I've also investigated. And I don't quite know how they found me, but they got in contact to say, what do you know about these sites? We are filming there, and do you have any information? And I thought, oh, that'd be nice, might get a chance to be in the program. But they'd already lined somebody else up to be in the program. They just said heard I knew a bit about the place. They then asked me if I knew anyone who knew about Jack the Ripper, which I know rather a lot about Jack the Ripper. So I said, well, actually, yes, me. And they asked if I would take them on a brief tour of the sites, which actually did appear very briefly in the program. So I've had a little experience, but they seem quite straightforward and friendly. It was all set up, and they filmed, and you have to sometimes you re-say the same thing because you missed the first time. But so you get a sense that it's not obviously what you're seeing for real. Yeah, so I get a sense that sometimes these things aren't quite as what they appear to be, but this is in a sense a little bit different because all the people who appear in it are verified as being genuine of their field. The sort of the lead scientist, if you like, is an astrophysicist of note. He's been around, he exists, he's real. And you think these people would have risked their credibility if they were too involved in something that was just complete nonsense. So it kind of adds a little bit of weight of reality to it. The other thing I noticed was how similar it is to a series called The Curse of Oak Island, which isn't paranormal at all. I mean, it is a kind of a treasure hunt digging around a little Oak Island up in Nova Scotia. And of course, it's made by the same people. So it has that same kind of the way the program's structured. It's kind of sensationalist. It's a little bit they go over the same thing quite a few times, particularly in Oak Island, especially. They repeat the same thing over and over again. And to a lesser extent in Skinwalker Ranch, there was a little bit of that repetition of the same thing, trying to hammer home the point of what was happening without necessarily really advancing it a lot. But you get a sense that there is certainly something anomalous occurring there. Now, I found the kind of more scientific kind of approach with genuine equipment for a change, not your average ghost box and that kind of thing, but proper surveying electronic equipment that was picking up things like gamma rays and radiation, also picking up things like there was a problem with the broadband signal. There was kind of a signal being blasted out, and the equipment showed proper spikes of patterns of how this equipment was being affected and was picking up. I forget what the equipment was called, but it was it was the real kit. It wasn't some kind of sort of made in someone's shed type stuff. It was genuine equipment. So that I found really interesting, that there does appear to be something there, exactly what the kind of generally leaning towards the idea, again, not saying too much, that it's something to do with underground. And one theme that came up, which really interested me, was the idea whenever they do anything to the site, either building something or digging the ground specifically, that's when the weird stuff happens. And that seems to be a common theme across various sort of sites and locations around the world, that when you start to disturb the earth seems to respond. And to me, it kind of fits in with the things like we've talked about before, the idea of some strange anomalous creatures who in modern times are seen to be coming from spaceships, but in sort of folkloric times of old, if you like, they would be seen as coming from hills or underground, or taking people underground rather than into spaceships. So there's always that kind of connection to the underworldness being something different, that there is a connection with what happens below the surface of the earth. There's a response on the surface of the earth and even above the surface of the earth at specific points. And it seems that very much Skinwalker Ranch is built to one of those points. That I found quite, I would say compelling is a bit too strong a word, but I found that really kind of connected with other ideas of strangeness, of the whole idea of, we talked before about the idea of areas in the world that have a greater propensity towards weirdness than other parts.
And in the book, they were told not to dig. It was one of the clauses, I think, when they bought the property, was they were warned not to dig. And also there's if you go through all the literature, you'll hear places that hear things moving underground. As if heavy machinery, as if there's some huge cavern under there. There's that. And of course, we get way out on the limb. We did the show on the Shaver mystery, which kind of, I think, when people responded to that. Shaver was probably a bit schizophrenic, and a lot of his information he was receiving probably wasn't objectively true, but people responded to it, and I think they did because there is that connection with the belief of things happening underground. And of course, the military often is blamed that they have some kind of a secret base, and there's even
Yeah.
a belief, in long tunnels that stretch all across different parts of the U.S. But yeah, it did seem, and that seemed to follow, because that's an impression you got by reading the book. Now, as you know, I'm a big fan of the book The Hunt for the Skinwalker, that was written by Colin Kelleher, scientist, and George Knapp. And that was now I can't remember the guy's name that owns the ranch now. His name escapes me. Brandon.
Yeah.
Yes. By the way, I've seen him make posts on Facebook in a Skinwalker Ranch post, and he comes across to me as somebody that's credible. He was defending what they were doing there, and saying that we're not fabricating stuff. We're just and I got the impression too that they're not letting everything out that they know, which kind of makes sense. But anyway, the hunt for the Skinwalker goes back when Robert Bigelow, the guy, the real estate billionaire, the guy that has actually put space platforms up in around the earth. He owned it for a while. He bought it from the Shermans. We should give people a little bit of history here that don't know about it. And the Sherman, it was the Sherman Ranch. I don't remember who they bought it from, but they noticed that the doors were very thick, and you could bolt the doors. There are, and another thing is, well, let me stay with the Shermans. They were high-end cattle ranchers, and they were thrilled to get this property at a good price. And but then they were plagued with all kinds of bizarre phenomena, stuff that you might think was otherworldly. But then you also have things like poltergeist phenomena. We can get into more of that later. And they were at their wits' end. And then Bigelow came in and bought the place. He created the National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDS, and Colin Kelleher was one of the main scientists on that team. George Knapp is a investigative reporter out of Las Vegas, and also does, I think, the Sunday show on Coast to Coast AM. Over the years, over the 90s, we would hear these tantalizing tidbits of things that they were finding on the ranch. Colin Kelleher would be on sometimes Knapp, sometimes together. Even Bigelow was on a couple times. So it was fascinating. And when this book came out in about 2006, maybe, boy, I saw it at the bookstore, and my wife said, it was getting close to Christmas, why don't you save that for a Christmas present? I said, are you crazy? I'm going to wait. Oh, no. I'm going to wait 3 weeks until Christmas. No, that's not going to happen. So, but the book is really, really fascinating. So, and another thing about Bigelow, I thought that since it was, at least it seemed like it had been sold to private interest, but I think he had a government connection. I was hoping more information would come out, but once the book came out, not much more did come out. I think, and there was one point when George Knapp was scheduled to do a documentary on it, but Bigelow asked him. He said, "Look, I can't tell you not to, but I wish you wouldn't, because they were plagued with people, like me, paranormal investigators, wanting to sneak on not that I would have done that, but sneaking on the ranch, and they had to spend a lot of their time on security, just trying to keep people off, trying to prevent people from hurting themselves and lawsuits. So that's a real rough thumbnail sketch of what brings us up to when Brandon bought the ranch. And he seems to be more open than Bigelow as far as releasing information. Is that your impression?
Yeah. Well, that's what I always found interesting. That he's bought this property, but yet the previous owner has kept much of the information about what they've discovered secret. I mean, how much Brendan's been actually told and how much he's saying for the program, of course, is a matter of debate. But clearly, there's a definite impression that he has not been told as much as he would like to know. And you do wonder if all that research is done. And yes, they do mention in the opening credits that Bigelow did receive some funding from the US government. So surely it gives the people a right to know something about what's discovered. Yet he's kept it all very close, sort of close to his chest, Bigelow, and saying very little about anything that they discovered. And they were there for a long time doing a lot of research. But I think one of the interesting things also with the program is that you can see the modernized approach now. Some of the most up-to-date equipment is being used, and that I find is helpful as well. So it's less kind of sort of guesswork as to what's going on, and more this is kind of unfolding, revealing. I mean, it's a TV program, so of course they're going to present it in a certain way, but there's more of a willingness to be open about what they're discovering with them cutting edge research they're doing into the place. But it, it is one of those places. I mean, from what they were saying, there's reports of go back centuries of strange happenings noted around the site, that sort of the local natives, particularly, of course, the whole story about the Skinwalker, where that comes from, but the two Native American tribes effectively at war with each other because one had basically enslaved the other one, and this is their revenge. So sometimes you think of those sorts of stories, it's almost like backwards engineered. That story is actually an explanation for the strange things that have been seen there in those times, back in the sort of American native times, rather than them being the cause of the strangeness, i.e. the Skinwalker. But the Skinwalker is the explanation for the strangeness. You see what I mean? They're kind of backwards engineering an explanation for why things of strange are happening there. But I mean, I can imagine trying to patrol that site would have been next to impossible, because it is a huge ranch, of course.
And
So
it's
you're
not
trying to
just,
keep people off all of it.
and the phenomenon, of course, isn't just there on the ranch. The entire Uinta Valley
Yes.
has been the recipient of it. Let's see, there's two things I want to mention. Back in about 2006, there was a group of people, I think they called themselves the Utah UFO Hunters. One of the researchers was a lady named April Slaughter, who was April Greenwald then, and I think another guy whose nickname was Alien Dave, and a few others. Well, they did a couple night vigils out near the ranch, very close by, and they experienced all kinds of bizarre stuff. They both times they would get to a point where here they are going to stay up all night to try and observe something strange because of the reputation of the ranch. And then they got to a point where, even though one time they saw this sort of a giant bird-like thing fly over and something else happened, and they're thinking to themselves, well, nothing much is really happening. We're going to go to bed. And so they retired early, and then later on they couldn't figure out what the heck. Sometime they had a couple of guys were kind of ill for months afterwards. Their systems weren't right. They underwent regressive hypnosis and only got fragments of what was going on. And it's I have the recording. I'll have to see if I can dig it up and send it to you. It was Dave Schrader on Darkness Radio back about 2006. Did a couple shows on the Skinwalker Ranch, and it's mind-numbingly, it's just wild. And that segues into the fact that when you read The Hunt for the Skinwalker, the level of activity there was crazy. And Sherman told Bigelow and his team when they came in, see, Sherman would sneak up on this stuff. He would lay in wait for hours to see if he could observe something, and sometimes he's freezing his body, it's freezing his tail off in the cold Utah winters. And for example, he was seeing these things that were sort of like towers in the sky. They gave off kind of an orangish light, and you could only see them if you were to drive around the ranch. They would kind of vanish if you looked at them from a certain angle. Well, one night, he would just lie in wait. And one night he was looking up, and it's almost like in the center of this thing, he could see a blue sky beyond it, as if it was a portal to somewhere else. And all of a sudden, a triangle like craft just zipped right through there like the eye of a needle and just vanished. So he told Bigelow, he said, you guys should not take a head-on approach. You should be very stealthy. And later on, Colin Kelleher, when he writes in the book The Hunt for the Skinwalker, he says that he thinks that Sherman was right. Because they went more of a head-on sort of a head-on collision to whatever was going on. They documented a lot of bizarre stuff, and we can get into some of that. But it did seem the level of the phenomena did seem to go down. And what we're seeing on the TV show is nothing like they were experiencing all kinds of cryptids and just high strangeness during this period of time in the 90s. They would. They had animal mutilations. They had, they could see the footprints of the calf running in the snow, and you could see with the way they were spaced, they were running faster. Then all of a sudden, it stops dead.
Mm.
They would, for a while there, they were seeing things like tropical birds up in the trees, and then these big oversized spiders, and then they would vanish. The opening of the book, The Hunt for the Skinwalker, they see this large, they called it a dire wolf. This thing is huge, and it seems to be very tame. It comes up to the property, but then it reaches its head through one of the bars and catches the head of a calf. Sherman blasts the thing with, I think, a revolver and a 30-06, and it barely registers. This thing walks off, leaves a series of footprints in the swamp, and then they lose sight of it. He and his son went after it. Then all of a sudden, the footprints stop dead. This is the first day they're there while they're moving in, and the opening of the book. And I can get into a lot more just bizarre stuff. But whatever's going on, it's certainly not at the level that it was when the Shermans had it.
Yeah, it's interesting how these things do seem to ebb and flow, the amount of strangeness. I mean, they've been, again, in the program, there have been a couple of incidents where they do believe they're genuinely chasing something that they're seeing, but we don't see. I know one of them, it was only appearing on thermal, as in obviously a temperature change was being caused, but there was nothing visible to the naked eye. And again, it's that kind, one of the things I love about this whole site is the idea of all these different phenomena all occurring in roughly the same place. You know, it's not fitting any particular genre or any particular kind of phenomenon. It's not all UFOs, it's not all cryptids, it's not all ghostly. It's all of them, you know, all at the same time. Which, I mean, one of the, I don't want to go too much detail, give too much away, but one of the explanations, the whole idea of the portal, the idea of realities from other realities being close to each other, that things kind of phase between the two, that sometimes these kind of overlaps occur, which creates that kind of portal idea that's what's happening here. I mean, one of the things that I forget his name, the Travis Taylor puts forward, he's
Yes.
the astrophysicist puts forward this whole idea that we're dealing with some kind of wormhole effect, that there is actually a wormhole very close by, and that this is what's causing the interaction with some other part of possibly the universe or another universe. And to hear someone of his standing and background say that, I mean, okay, I know voices of science fiction writers have discovered subsequently, but that he's willing to sort of say it on camera, as it were, which, you know, in his kind of field, it could affect his reputation. It suggests he genuinely believes there is a possibility that that's what's going on here. Much to the amazement of some of the faces in the room as he's talking to them. They're like, "What, really?" But you know, if you're going to try and find an explanation that fits what's going on, then that it leans in that direction. You know, that we are dealing with some kind of alternate realities crossing into each other, and at the very least, creating strange, anomalous distortions. I mean, you can argue that a kind of a more skeptical approach might be that there is something under the ground that's physical, that's causing effects to electromagnetic waves, causing field distortion, which is what they've discovered. Then it could be affecting the mind and creating all sorts of strange imagery that's not actually there. But you know, there have been in the past experiments where people have been exposed to huge EMF fields to try and create mental distortions, and the only thing they've ever seemed to do is create odd feelings. You know, a friend of mine looked into this a few years back, into the research that was done behind this kind of phenomena when you affect people with powerful magnets and the like, to see how it does to the brain. And what they were saying was it creates strange feeling and emotion, but it doesn't create visions or images. I mean, he was talking more specifically about ghost investigations, but it wasn't creating visual phenomena people were seeing, just that they felt strange. So again, it kind of leans, well, if there is something there that is distorting the EM field, which, as I say, appears to be the case, it might explain some of the odd feeling and sensations, but it wouldn't necessarily explain what people are actually seeing. And that's what's interesting, as we've talked before, this idea that these things temporarily manifest almost as physical and create a physical effect, but then just disappear, kind of phase out. But again, if you're talking about some kind of portal effect, then maybe they're switching back to their own reality. Whether they do it deliberately or it is just simply the walking along and suddenly you find yourself somewhere else, carry on walking, you're back to where you were. I don't know. You know, is it a definite, deliberate attempt to kind of cross into our reality, or is it just these things are phasing into each other?
It's interesting, sometimes the getting the feeling, the creepy feeling, or the feeling of terror or dread or whatever. That was I think it was T.C. Lethbridge, the dowser, when he was doing his experiments with the pendulum and doing, really ghost research, he called the ghost was the apparition, but sometimes you would just get, when you were in one of these places, you would just get a feeling, and sometimes a feeling of dread. He called that a ghoul. So it's kind of interesting to differentiate the two types. And it makes me think of John Keel when he was in the first investigating the Mothman, and he was in the TNT area. He talks about walking into a zone of fear. And he was hypothesizing that it was some kind of like a microwave tower or something. But Colin Wilson said, no, John Keel experienced a ghoul. Something was there in the same, maybe in the same similar way that these things are in some of these areas, that had a direct emotional effect on his consciousness.
Yeah.
Also, I was thinking about, remember some of the more recent episodes of the Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. They were talking to some of the Junior Hicks family. Junior Hicks was a well-known high school teacher, science teacher in that area. And he was very well respected. So he collected an amazing amount of UFO type reports in that whole area, which predate the Shermans and Bigelow and so forth. And the book was written by Frank Salisbury, who used Junior Hicks' research in his book called The Utah UFO Display. And it's fascinating because there's a couple pages in there of all the different types of craft or whatever they really are that the people are seeing, and none of them are the same. And you and I have talked about this before.
Yes,
the variety of entities and craft that are reported. And come to think of it, there was a variety of critters that were seen on the ranch. The dire wolves or whatever they were seemed to disappear. Others saw them too. Other locals had seen them. But then Gwen Sherman, one time she was about ready to get out of her car, and there's this big, ugly, dog-like creature, an oversized head. I can't remember whether the legs were abnormally long or short, and this thing was really kind of hideous looking. And they would see these things there for a while. And then there was the night that I'm telling you, people that are listening to this, if you haven't read Hunt for the Skinwalker, you need to check it out. There was the day when, now the NIDS team wasn't there all the time. They were on call. They had a lot of night vigils and so forth, but they weren't always there. Well, this is in the dead of winter, and the Shermans had a calf had just been birthed, and it was just over a rise, not too far away. All of a sudden, the Sherman's dog alerted on something and took off. Was never seen again. They went over this rise and they found the mother is standing there, but the calf is laying there bloodless with the center, the ribs were actually like pulled open. I mean, it's a horrible mutilation. And of course, they called then the NIDS team. They did an examination on it as quickly as they could. Over the next couple of days, they were something. The dogs and everything were alerting on something. They were very disturbed, and they were missing. He was missing one of the cows, and he went and he found it. This is dark now. And they found it was standing under a tree. And then they noticed there was something in the tree. They could see the glowing eyes, the glow of the eyes. And then there was also something else, like perhaps one of these dogs or the wolf or something, not too far from the calf. Well, Sherman plugged them both. He's sure he hit them. And the thing in the tree, it sounded like it hit the ground and took off. But they only found one footprint, and it looked kind of like a raptor footprint. Like a giant bird or something, and they didn't find any other footprints. So they all saw it. They couldn't see it clearly, but there was something there, and it seemed like it was luring the cow off separate. Remember how in the one episode last season, I think there was a cow that was isolated that died.
Yes, it's one of the areas that I find pretty grim and fascinating. the whole cattle mutilation business, I failed to get my head around what on earth that's about. I mean, there's the obvious standard explanation is alien spaceships coming down, making these examinations. But even so, why would they be chopping bits of cows out? Why would they be removing it?
I
mean,
I have no, I mean, the same, I'll let you keep going, but I have racked my brain to try and understand if whether it's the military, whether it's some other intelligence or something natural to the planet. Why?
yes, it is. It's the strangest thing. Certainly, the photographs I've seen. I mean, the one cow that did die in the program. They said although there was nothing physically done to it, there's no mutilation as such. Then in the second series, they returned back to the corpse, which has been left out, because usually these things get stripped bare by predators and
Yeah.
bugs and the like. And apparently, it's untouched. And even the sort of senior vet who came along to examine it and took part of the leg away to examine it to see if they could find perhaps it was because it had been poisoned and the other animals were aware it was poisoned and don't want to eat it because it would affect them. It came back and said, there's nothing wrong with this. I don't understand it. There's nothing wrong, but yet it's untouched by other animals. And that was particularly strange. And I was quite struck by that one. But it's often mystified me. I not that long ago would have always dismissed so-called cattle mutilations as being earthbound and just sick individuals doing these things, and perhaps not as common as people made out. And because obviously if your cattle die and they're insured, you can make money. You get your money back out of that. That's one way of sort of refinancing yourself. And there's something I'd read that the suggestion had been made, but I don't know. It still mystifies me, and it seems to be perhaps the most physical thing that happens on the ranch in terms of all the other phenomena. I mean, a lot of that's passing phenomena, whether it's an animal going past or say tracks being left behind on noises, they're all transitory. But the most physical element is this destruction of wildlife, of the common herd. And that brings me to what I was going to say. It seems to be it's just the herds that are damaged. There's no wildlife. There's no sort of foxes or other animals that are found mutilated in the same way. It's just the bloody cows. And that in itself is strange. I know in the first episode they had a couple of llamas on the site.
Oh, yeah.
They did capture something attacking one of them. Now, unfortunately, they could have just put the cameras in a slightly better position to actually see into the land, because you get this brief glimpse of something's in the little field with the two llamas. But again, they're not in the second season, so I don't know whatever became of those. But that could have been just like a wolf or coyote or something that got into it. It was still, it was still the fact that there were animals were kind of there and then were almost being targeted. Because again, we've heard a few different stories about what's happened to cows. I know the Shermans had one particular experience where the cows went missing. They found them in a barn stacked on top of each other. They thought they were dead, but in fact they weren't. So how the cows were alive and stacked on top of each other, three of them, and were still alive is an absolute mystery. But yeah, that's where they were found.
And that's not the only incident. There's a famous incident in the book with these bulls, these Angus bulls, and it was again, Gwen Sherman says to her husband, they were on another part of the ranch doing something, checking on the animals or something, and this is the NIDS team was involved, and they were in the midst of this craziness, I guess, but they were still, the Shermans were still on the property. And Ellen, and I'm sorry, that was her name in the book, but it's Gwen Sherman said, I hope, I don't know what I'll do if anything happens to those bulls. Within a half hour later, they get to where the bulls are, and the pen is all penned up, but there's no bulls. And they're frantic. There's no footprints. Where the hell are the bulls? And there's this old white trailer there that hasn't been used. Sherman hears something, or he's drawn to it somehow. He looks in the window, and there's the four bulls crammed in there, alive, but in a stupor, got crammed in, kind of like this other incident. And he's pounding on the trailer. They kind of wake up, and of course they're in this horrible confinement, and they just kick their way out, destroy the trailer, and it takes them hours to gather them together. So but then, if you kind of look at the literature, we've talked before about Randall Pugh and F.W. Holliday, Holiday of Loch Ness fame, they wrote a book called The Dubbed Enigma about the bizarre goings on in Wales, southwest Wales in 1977. And it's a three-ring circus of the paranormal, 7-foot silver-suited beings, little guys that look like leprechauns associated with craft, strange lights. But there's an incident where the Billy Coombs, he's a cattle farmer, and he 100 of his cattle disappear from their pen overnight, and it's all strapped up like the way it was, and they're found a half-mile away on the Broadmoor farm. Yes, and the thing is, some said, well, it was a prank. Somebody let them out, and even though the cows, I guess, go by where they're sleeping, they said, well, they're sound sleepers. And they would have had to lead them there, because you have to make a 90-degree angle turn, apparently, to get to the Broadmoor farm. Well, a few days later, Coombs put 16 of them in a pen, and then he turns around, goes into the barn, turns on the milk machines, and then comes out, and they're gone. The 16 cows end up at the Broadmoor farm. There's even one other incident, but what they were doing in the Dubbed Enigma, they found a lot of parallels with traditions of folklore and what was seen to be going presently on there. And we've talked about that before. Jacques Vallée kind of being the pioneer of that with Passport to Magonia. Well, they weren't dogmatic, and of course they were speculating, but they found there's a tradition in many different traditions of folklore. And they found one in Norway where the milkmaid couldn't keep her cow in the pen. She goes to get her bucket to milk the cow, and it's gone. Eventually, one of the little guys, one of the elementals, the fairies, come and say, you can't put your cow there because it's spoiling our food. So their speculation was that perhaps the elementals derived their food, so to speak, from earth energies, and the placement of cattle in a certain area might disrupt it. But if we remember the moment Gwen Sherman said, if anything happens to those bulls, it's like the trickster effect.
Yes,
it's like somebody was listening. And that's not the only thing. If you isolate certain aspects of what happens on the Skinwalker Ranch, you might think ET or extra dimensionals, but if you look at the whole broad spectrum, you're getting disembodied voices and strange languages. Gwen Sherman would go take a shower, and her hairbrush and everything would end up in the refrigerator. Sherman, I can't remember his first name. He was out with his post hole digger. He turns around to get his post hole digger, and it's gone. At first, he thinks the kids are playing a prank on him. He finds it 2 weeks later, way up in the tree, up in the branches. So there's a whole series of that kind of thing going on, intermixed with stuff that we might be able to wrap our heads around if we think ET.
Mm-hmm. That's the thing. It's not fitting that single criteria again, as we were saying before. That's one of the things I found most fascinating. Often people will kind of boil down experiences like this to extraterrestrials. Must be them. That's the logical explanation, almost as if that's more acceptable than the idea of sort of trans-reality portals. Why is one more acceptable than the other one? The idea that somehow it's more fringe to talk of in those sorts of terms. But it is interesting. Again, the trickster element is an important feature we've found many times on various occasions and cases where it is almost as if it's responding to us, but in an irritating way. It is kind of playing games as if these things, whatever they are, have the ability to just, because they are, I suppose, in some way superior, that they can just manipulate things that we can't, and just annoy us by doing it, just to say, hey, we're here, we are aware. And again, if it's things like they're affected by energy changes that are being caused by other things, like the cows being in the wrong place, they are, kind of a nice way trying to get you to do something different, to try to act differently or do something different, because it's having an effect on them that we don't understand, but they're trying to get across to us, look, stop doing this because it's causing irritation. So we're going to do something to irritate you almost, rather than be sort of particularly aggressive or negative. They're just doing something to irritate rather than cause a major problem. And maybe that's what's happening with these trickster things. It's trying to get you to respond in a way that suits them. I'm speculating here, obviously, but it is,
right.
It's a possibility, I
Do you,
suppose.
do you think that implies the trickster element? Do you think that implies that this has to do something to do with human consciousness, or that somehow we co-create some of these things with some energy or something?
Yes, I mean that comes down to what I've always said, that effectively these things are, and I think it explains also the fact that these phenomena are so different, as we've said previously. The fact that they manifest differently to different people is because they're taking their identity from us, not their existence from us, but the how we can perceive them does vary depending on our own belief systems and our own ideas, and how susceptible we are to certain experiences as well. I think also plays a part. That's why perhaps the Shermans were experienced and saw more, because perhaps they were more fearful, and therefore there was a response to that fearfulness that more appeared to happen, rather than hopefully if you're fearful they ease back. No, the reverse. They do more because you're fearful. If you come forward with a kind of not closed mindset, but more kind of I'm not putting up for any of this kind of mindset, then less tends to happen, I think. And perhaps if you're being very scientific in your approach, you're seeing less because it doesn't conform to how they want to be presented, if you like. That kind of, the scientific approach sees less and experiences less because of the approach itself. More kind of open mind, let's just allow what happens to happen, and then perhaps it presents differently. But it's all to do with, I believe, a response to our mindset in terms of how they appear. I mean, I'm kind of repeat myself a bit, but it's basically I do believe that's the case. And it does explain why so many different phenomena can be seen in the same place, because of the perceiver's own understanding of that phenomena alters the phenomena.
And why the phenomena over history has seemed to sort of shape itself around our expectations. The
Mm,
majestic airships of 1897, a little bit more advanced than we had at the time, dirigibles and zeppelins and so forth,
yeah.
and all the way up to the present. And you are listening to the High Strangeness Factor, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I am Steve Ward, and today Andy and I are talking about the infamous Skinwalker Ranch and other high strangeness spots. Andy, you mentioned the idea of portals. Well, they had John B. Alexander on. He was a retired U.S. Army colonel who was
Mm,
part of the NIDS team. And I've heard him, he's written his own books on UFOs, and he unashamedly says we're dealing with a portal.
mm,
End
yeah.
of story. So, and there's so many, there's another incident. They had, I remember reading in the book about Sherman seeing something that he thought was an RV trespassing on the property. And his nephew, I think it was, that was there at the time, was interviewed on this most recent season of the Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. And what the incident was, Sherman thought, well, we're going to get this guy now. He can see it driving away, and it's going to come up to a fence line. There's no way they're going to get over that, and we're going to trap him and, chew this guy out. Well, it gets up to the fence line and slowly drifts over it and then lands on the other side and keeps moving.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that happened over and over again that sent a chill down their spine. There was an incident when the NIDS team was all set up. They had cameras, several, 4 or 5 cameras set up in this one area that was, I think, kind of a hot spot. And all of a sudden they found out that several of the cameras stopped malfunctioning. And when they checked them out, the wires were literally ripped out, the cables to power them. And they found that one camera was still operating and did have a view, not a clear view because it was so dark, of the other cameras, but it could see when the lights went out on the cameras when they lost power, but they were unable to see anything else. So it's almost like, maybe not the trickster, but it's like, what the hell are you doing trying to observe us and what we're doing? Stay away.
Yes, I mean it always comes back for me, that line that is in the Mothman film, the idea that they notice that you noticed them. Almost as if once you're aware that they're there, they will be more aware that you're aware they're there, and that kind of starts to build up that pattern. It's almost as if you're unknowingly going there and not really aware of what's happening, and less tends to happen. But it's like, we don't necessarily want to be observed. We won't want to fit into what you're trying to do. But I think if you go there, I think also it comes to me an idea that if you go there with a certain mindset and approach, they will try and break that approach because it is too narrow. It's like, if you want to see it as that certain way, we're not going to present it that certain way. Again, I mean, maybe ascribing too much of a sentientness to whatever these things are. They might not be Well, I say might not. I don't think they're going to be sentient in the same way that we are, because I think that's part of the fact. That's why what happens is so strange, because it doesn't fit with our generalized understanding of what is normal, what's rational, etc. That their understanding of how they operate, it could be very different to us, and what might seem normal to us seems bizarre to them, and vice versa. Again, that's apportioning a certain degree of intelligence that might not actually exist. But it depends, if we're talking about something that is coming from another reality, then perhaps it does have its own understandings of life, the universe, and everything that might be very different to us, but has its own. But if it's something that we kind of collectively generate, which again is a real possibility, not that we're making it up, but it's kind of a general generated creation from shared mind, then it's going to have a less of an identity, a less of a sense of self, or less of a sense of continual pattern of behavior. It's just to be completely random, because it's formed randomly. I don't know if I'm making sense there. What I'm trying to say, getting that kind of idea that if it's coming from us as a collective, there's no individual sense of awareness within it. Whereas if it is something from another reality, then although it might not make sense of how we view reality or how we work, it will work to its own criteria. So, but if it's from us, there's no criteria, if you like.
But it still seems that even if that's the case, if there is some external intelligence or energy or force, it still seems that we interacted in some way where it shapes around us. Like Keel talked about paranormal mimicry, and how he felt like a lot of the incidents that were going on were actually focused on him, almost teaching him, there to actually say to him, yes, we're here, this is what we're doing, and we're showing you something.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. The idea that interactivity itself is generated or generates the phenomena. The interaction itself generates a phenomena, rather than being, excuse me, a passive thing that then reacts to the fact you're being watched. It's rather than just being person A watching person B, and because person A is being watched by person B, they act a certain way. It's more the action that they do is generated by the fact they're being observed. It's a bit like that kind of quantum physics thing about that things being observed perform differently to when they're not being observed. The observer affects what they're observing, which is quite a revolutionary idea in physics, because the idea was you're always, before that, a passive observer simply watching what was happening. But now it's more that if you're observing, your act of observation affects the phenomenon. I mean, this is science we're talking about here. So again, perhaps that's what's happening there. Again, to a greater degree, that the idea that whatever your belief system you bring to your observations will affect what you observe. If you come without a belief system, or as little as possible, then perhaps you observe less, because you're not bringing anything, you're not giving it fuel, if you like, not giving it something to work with. You're just expecting it to work by itself. But if there's no separate self, if you like, then it can't perform on its own, because it hasn't got a self to perform with. And I am talking gobbledygook now. But hopefully the listener can rewind and listen a few times to what I'm saying and think, oh, I get it now. Yeah, no, he's talking nonsense. So I come to one conclusion or the other, I'm sure.
Andy, they've left us by now. They said, "Where the hell's the damn guest?" And they're gone. They're gone.
Exactly.
But there's another incident that where two of the observers, I don't know if they're a scientist or not, they're unnamed, and this is in the hunt for the Skinwalker. They were on a ridge, and one of them had a pair of night vision goggles, and they were seeing something that looked like just an orb or a ball of light. It was stationary, and the one without the goggles just saw a faint light. The one with the goggles started to see, he got all excited. He said, it's like a tunnel, and there was something crawling out of it. And it was like a narrow tunnel, and it was as if it was using its elbows to move through it. Well, this thing steps out onto the ground, and it's about the size and bulk of a Bigfoot, I guess, but it was hairless. And the guy swore that it had no facial features. And this guy is just freaking out, and it made me think of the 50 film, 1954 Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where
Oh,
the
yeah.
seed pods are copying the individual, but it's at a certain point where there's nothing defined. The face isn't completely defined. So I'm not suggesting that there are seed pods on the Skinwalker Ranch, but it's kind of interesting when you talk about people like John Keel suggesting that these things are transmogrifications of energy, that they're that these are paraphysical, that they're not illusions per se, but they are temporarily physical, and sometimes he wasn't concerned about whether the person saw a craft or a creature. He didn't care if the craft had a dome or portholes or what the creature looked like. He was interested in that cosmic mechanism that was, he felt, projecting or creating these images. And perhaps perhaps he was right.
I think so, absolutely. I mean, and it's one thing we've talked about before. The very nature of what is supposedly seen suggests that it's more than simply for other planets, because these things that are observed are predominantly humanoid in appearance, 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, mouth, all that kind of thing, similar kind of built and height, suggests that they're coming from here. But again, you might think, well, perhaps that's because that's how they are perceived, because of what we have as expectations of these things. It often strikes you that not a lot of times you get, again, I could be wrong here, but you get the feeling that a lot of people who observe phenomena were of a mindset to observe it, if you know what I mean. They're kind of more likely to be receptive to these kind of experiences. People don't, again, this is just talking about people I've met over the years who've had ghostly experiences or even UFO experiences. They already had an interest. It seems to be something that I've noticed quite a lot. You don't tend to get people who've had no experience whatsoever, no interest, and all of a sudden have an odd experience. They seem to be those who have an interest with sometimes actually science fiction or ghost stories, that kind of stuff. I mean, there's a specific situation I'm talking about here, which is when I did a lot of research into sleep paralysis, hypnagogic dreaming, which manifests as the old hag syndrome, or the idea of alien abduction. How people who had a certain mindset or interest would experience this odd mental state as if it was in accordance with what they believed. Or if someone's into science fiction and fantasy, they would have alien experience. If they're into ghosts or supernatural, even just horror novels or ghost stories, they'd have a more sort of paranormal experience of some kind of like the old hag syndrome or a ghostly figure in the room. So again, that mindset of what you're going to experience is going to conform to what you kind of understand and believe in, but that's not necessarily what it actually is. And again, like you're saying with those 2 people, the different observers observing the same phenomena, reporting things back differently. If it is purely a physical thing that's out there in front of you, be it Skinwalker or anywhere else, there should be a good degree of conformity in the description, but often there isn't. Often they're very different. Again, personal experience of paranormal investigations, ghost experiences, where 2 or 3 people have seen a phenomena on an event, and when you ask them afterwards what they observed different things, but they were looking at the same thing, but what they saw or experienced was different to the person next to them. And yet the art skeptic who will genuinely say they never saw anything. That's one of the ones I find interesting, because it's not them denying or pretending otherwise. Saying, no, I genuinely didn't see anything. You said you saw this, they said they saw that, but I saw nothing. So, there is that definite element of what presents itself is dependent to some degree on what you're looking for, what you're interested in. But one of the things that caught my ear a couple of times was when they talked about lights, strange lights that were being seen. And there was at least one occasion, maybe 2, where they spoke about a bright yellow light that made somebody feel uncomfortable. And that really struck a chord with me because as you know, another passion interest of mine is the Dyatlov Pass incident in Russia in 1959. And there were reports in later years by 2 individuals. One was basically sort of looked after a mining site at night security, excuse me, and the other one was like a hunter who was used to be out of the woods at night. And both of them, in a fairly close time frame to each other, both observed strange yellow-white light moving through the forest towards them that scared the proverbial out of them. Now, these were both seasoned individuals who used to be working out in the dark at night in sort of the Russian Ural Mountains, that pretty much nothing would normally scare them at all, but they were absolutely spooked by these lights. And one guy said specifically, I have no idea what it was about those lights, but they made me really uncomfortable, were quite frightened. And there was definitely at least one incident that was mentioned in the program where something similar was seen. So I often wonder perhaps the light phenomena it's in its purest form, if you like. There's no kind of shape or definition of appearance in the light. It's just an off-white light. That maybe that's like a pure form.
And there's even there was another incident where this is, I think before the NIDS team came on board, the Shermans had talked to some UFO people about the stuff going on the ranch, and I think Chris O'Brien, who wrote a couple of books on the on that area of well, Colorado and New Mexico as well, but so it got out in the papers a little bit, and there was somebody that a guy that drove a long distance and came on the ranch and said, you know, I feel some kind of a, I don't know, kinship here, and I wonder if you would let me, you know, meditate. And so father and son kind of looked at each other and thought, sure, why not? So they dropped him off at this one spot, and he's doing his meditation. And then all of a sudden, there's something moving in the trees, and there's something making a lot of noise. And that there was this, that they called it the, later on when they saw the film Predator, they said that's what it looked like. That some others call it, Bigfoot researchers call it the shimmer. But this thing came toward him. They couldn't see it clearly, scared the hell out of him. And he begged them to get him off the ranch as soon as possible. But then this shows up in a book called Valley of the Skookum by Sally Shepard Wolford. She's the mom of the famous Bigfoot researcher Autumn Williams. And Autumn was 3 to 6 years old when they were in Ording, Washington, and had a whole level of high strangeness with Bigfoot, UFOs, and so forth. But the Native Americans there called it the shimmer. And according to the local Native Americans there, they said that was a portal that Bigfoot came in and out of. And Tom Powell, another Bigfoot researcher that started out thinking that these things were purely flesh and blood, got pulled over to the dark side, like so many of us, and began to believe, for a lot of reasons and a lot of the testimony, that it was something paranormal. He also had some very hardcore Bigfoot researchers experience that. And then finally, you probably remember David Paulides, Missing 411. Yes. He did the book on hunters, yes. And there was the hunter, actually Mrs. Maccabee, Bruce Maccabee's wife, saw this shimmer effect. She took a photograph. It can actually see hairs coming out the side of it. Her husband was a photographic expert for the Navy. He examined it. There was a UFO sighting by her nephew about the same time, about a half mile away, when he was at band practice at school. I mean, I'm really doing the Reader's Digest version of this, but it's another one of these patterns. I mean, the stuff going on in the Skinwalker Ranch and some of these places is not isolated. It is, you know, that there's something, and it's another thread we might take from this is this guy, the guy doing the meditation. Sometimes expectation, or when someone sort of projects something in the form of expectation or ritual. As in, remember the rabbi in the one episode, and I don't remember. I know the instruments went crazy because they were actually getting physical readings after this basic Jewish ritual he did.
Well, it was, they were filming the Homestead 2, which is one of the buildings on the site that's dilapidated now, and they were noticing extraordinary temperature changes that were really unaccountable.
Oh, that's right.
Changes. That was the really strange thing. It was going from hot to cold. And I remember correctly, the actual building itself went incredibly cold at one point. And the rabbi actually said that that's one of the phenomena they've experienced when things are manifesting. And, you know, again, obviously in the world of ghosts and the paranormal, that's a common thing where suddenly the temperature drops. Sometimes you don't read it on a thermometer, but you feel it. And it's more of an ionization effect. But what they were showing thermally was very definite temperature changes. And then, of course, at one moment there was something that passed by on the bottom of the screen incredibly fast and was colder than the environment around it. So it clearly wasn't an animal that was shot through, but something passed underneath. But yeah, I know they even tried afterwards just playing a recording of what the rabbi was saying, and it had a very definite effect. And of course, that links very much into ritual magic we've talked about before, which is something I'm involved in, not so much these days, but used to be quite more actively involved in, that you definitely notice phenomena. You can change things around you. How it works, the mechanisms behind it, I have no idea. But not that long ago, on a particular little investigation I did with some friends, I've got a thing called a bone flute. It's actually a human femur it's made from, ethically sourced, legally and ethically sourced. There's no problem there. And we were in wood, just sort of knows, it's a particular wood called Clapper wood that's got quite a history to it. But we tried a little experiment. I just blew through the trumpet, and it's supposed to have a summoning effect. And this wind just started to move around the trees above us. Literally, there was 5 of us, 4 or 5 of us there, all observed it, and it was at the same time as I blew the flute. You could say it was a coincidence, but no, it definitely was specifically designed to try and cause a manifestation, and it seemed to do that. So, the fact that ritual intonement, whether it's spoken word that's being said by a rabbi or anybody who's using ritual magic, or in notes and sounds that are being made with a certain intent in mind. I mean, the bone flute plays like a flute, basically, a single note flute. That's all it makes. But because of its nature, what it's for and how it's consecrated, it does seem to have a very real effect. And I say not just with me using it on my own, but that others around me observed it having that effect. So there is definitely a link here between these two. The idea that if using what you call ritual magic or ceremonial magic or incantations or whichever term people prefer in a particular place that is already active clearly causes things to happen. There's no doubt about it. I think that rabbi experiment, if the program is to be believed, of course, we always have to caveat with that we're not being duped completely here, seemed to show that there is a definite phenomenon that occurs. And what was also very interesting was something I came across in research for a book that I've written that's not yet out. The whole idea of there being other races already upon the earth that's actually in the Bible, and it says that other sort of similarly advanced, even further advanced beings are actually in the world with us. Now, you could take that as being a literal thing of actual living other beings here, or you could take it as referring to angelic beings, or is referring to the kind of things you're talking about, not fully corporeal entities that nevertheless exist amongst us, not generated by us, but there's a close association of effect between us and them, but they're actually here with us. And it's interesting that he brought that point out, because that kind of links to the whole idea of, maybe it is in this reality these things are moving, not fully physically within our reality, that they are either partly elsewhere or just partly not completely physical, that they are nevertheless present and have and cause effect.
Some people believe the jinn are fulfill that criteria. But there's also the term crypto-terrestrials, that they have. There's a. I'm trying to remember. Oh gosh, the book A Shimmering Light by Walter Bosley, where his father over a period of time was in intelligence, and he was a part of a crew that would clean up after airplane crashes. Well, they had something. They were diverted somewhere in Arizona or whatever to a crash site, and supposedly it was the same. It was the Roswell, in quotes, aliens, which weren't aliens at all, but this was a year later. This was another crash, and they were a break off of the human race about 1,000 years before because of climate changes or something. They, developed their own technology and so forth underground. They looked very much like us, only almost hairless and very pale, which would make sense. And they didn't want really anything to do with us, but it was some kind of a cooperation thing. So, and Bosley is the book is really interesting. He's very careful about it. He says there's some holes in the story of what his father tells. I mean, some of it's very consistent, but he thought also perhaps this might have been some kind of a, for lack of a better term, MK Ultra screen memory for something else that was going on. But he didn't completely reject the idea that, I mean, that's, for me, whatever the truth is about Roswell, and it's probably nothing, but that's the coolest explanation, and that's the one I want it to be: crypto-terrestrials.
That sounds quite an interesting idea, certainly. Yeah, it's one of those kind of things that strikes me again, is this notion of, I've lost my thread there. My brain just froze for a second there. I've just lost completely the thread of what I was going to say. It's just gone out of my head. I'll remember what this point.
That happens to me almost every show, and usually it's a pretty damn good idea that I remember later. But in the meantime, let's continue. Let's talk about this ritual thing a little bit. The biggest, the classic one, of course, you know, I've been investigating and looking into the Loch Ness monster and other beasties that inhabit the water, at least supposedly. And there was a Dr. Donald Oman who teamed up with Ted Holliday to exorcise the Loch Ness monster. And Dr. Oman was an Anglican exorcist, and fascinating guy. I mean, he exercised the Bermuda Triangle. His history a little bit was sometime years before in Loch Long, he saw a couple of these humps, like a Nessie-like creature. And then he told that a year later to a Norwegian sea captain. And the Norwegian sea captain said, "You need to come with me to the Fjord of Trolls because they're there too." And the sea captain believed that they were not physically dangerous, but they had something to do with spiritual evil. People that saw them would have family problems or just terrible things happen to them. So in fact, supposedly they went there, they saw these two more of these humps or whatever, came close to the boat. Oman's very tense that something was going to happen, but they veered off at the last minute, and that was it. I believe he was supposed to have performed some kind of an exorcism. He was he did a lot of those kinds of things. There were areas on certain roadways where people supposedly they would get into the hospital and they would say that somehow inexplicably they had the idea to turn into the oncoming car. And there was certain areas where this was happening. They called them dark spots. So Oman supposedly went there and did an exorcism and had, beneficial results. But anyway, in his book on some of the things he had done as an exorcist, Ted Holliday sees this because he had begun believing that the Loch Ness monster was something beyond just a physical creature. He was very influenced by Carl Jung when he read, Flying Saucers, a myth of things seen in the sky. So I'm again, this is a long story, but they end up going to Loch Ness and they go to the four corners of the loch and do the exorcism, and they did the final one in the center of the loch. And after they got back, it was the Careys. Mr. Carey was, I think, a retired RAF officer, and Mrs. Carey, they had loaned them their boat. It was a very low-tech operation. BBC got involved with it on a lark, I'm sure. And so they did this, and afterwards they felt like something really happened. And by the way, Oman didn't think that Nessie itself was evil. He thought it was sort of a ghost of an old dinosaur or something like that. But somehow evil attached itself to it. Never explained how that would happen. And that's what he was doing, is not getting rid of the monster itself, but the evil attached to it. Okay, so Holiday gets back. He's exhausted. Mrs. Carey's there. Mr. Carey has got the right idea. He's got his back turned to them, and he's mixing another drink. Well, in the meantime, Holiday and Mrs. Carey, they hear this huge, incredible noise. They look out, see sort of a pyramidal or funnel cloud, and just thumping, and then all of a sudden it stops. But Mrs. Carey saw a beam of light come through the window, strike Holiday in the forehead. He didn't see or feel anything, but it was at the area where supposedly Oman had put during the ceremony, the holy water on his forehead. So, and again, Mr. Carey, I don't know how many drinks he had, but he saw and felt nothing. So we don't have a record of the number. But anyway, the point is that they go through this ritual. They really feel, I mean, they feel like it has done something, if nothing, if not just drained their energy. And then the next day, Holiday is walking along the shore. He's thinking about the incredible, because he went from thinking Nessie was a plesiosaur to an oversized mollusk, and recognizing that it's kind of a UFO hotspot, and went through this whole long journey. And then he looks and he sees a man in black standing toward the road, and he's just standing there like an apparition. And he thinks, okay, am I seeing things? Is this a residue from yesterday? Am I crazy? So he walks over toward it, and as he gets close, he's planning on reaching out and touching it to see if it's actually real. But as it gets out of his sight a little bit, out of the corner of his eye, he hears a pop, and it's gone.
Yeah.
A year later, he has a heart attack almost on the same spot, and he realizes as they're carrying him to the ambulance, they carried him over the exact same spot where he saw this apparition. So I don't, again, this is, they performed some kind of a ritual. There was some kind of intention put there in the ethers, and something happened. So and another quickly, Jonathan Downes, a great British cryptozoologist, he did investigations into the Cornwall owl man, and he felt he had a tremendous psychic backlash afterwards. Pets died, and just had a whole series of horrible luck afterwards. So it's just another possible aspect of ritual. And now ritual doesn't always have a negative effect, but in these cases, it seemed to.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I find interesting, is the notion of the pop you just mentioned there. I think there was actually in Skinwalker itself. They talked about a noise and then something happening. Because again, it reminds me back of the Paulides, David Paulides stuff. One of the cases he investigated was the guys who went on the hunting trip, and the older chap stayed behind and sort of sat on the rock whilst they went off. And then one of the guys reported this strange pop sound. He'd never, like a door slam in the middle of the woods, and the other guy disappeared. And that was the only thing he noticed that was odd, was this strange sound he'd heard, like as if you could old portals again, that one's just opened and it's caused like this pop. Someone's taken through it or walked through it to investigate it, and it closes and they're gone. It's that kind of movement between, again, that sort of shifting through realities. And one of the things I find I tend to do, again, that must have been not so much either, I don't see another time, but when I used to be more actively involved, is I was very much into what you might describe as astral projection, the idea of traveling to places. Now, I never knew where they were in terms of relation to this physical world. Now, to me, it felt very much like I was going somewhere. There was a sense of imagery that was much stronger than just imagination. One of the good examples of the early days, I used to think was a knock-in magic of Dr. John Dee. Part of that is a scrying system where you can visit places, other realities, if you like. And what I'd noticed was that what I was seeing and making note of when I read other reports of other people subsequently on the then fledgling internet, this is talking 20 odd years ago, how descriptions were surprisingly similar for people I'd never met before, were having similar visions to what I was having, which convinced me that although I wasn't physically leaving my body, I didn't think, my mind was going somewhere. Now, it could be potentially, again, we're talking about these other realities that are less completely physical than ours, but nevertheless exist and look, they are connecting to. But somehow, sometimes there is a physical connection and things move from our world into the other ones. That's why things like the 411 disappearances are occurring, because these people have literally shifted from one reality to another one, then come back and end up being somewhere miles and miles from where they were before. And time has passed by, but not for them. Again, another one that catches my mind is the incident where a chap basically disappeared for a period of time. His body was eventually found some miles away from where he was found, and he was dead. I think just bones were left. But another site nearby, much later on, his thermos flask was found sitting on a rock not far from a farm. I don't know if you remember what I'm talking about. It was just his thermos was there. It's like, well, how did that get there? Where does that come from? It just suddenly appear. sitting on a rock near a farm at the base of the hills where he got lost months before. I don't know if you recall the one I'm talking about, but I was quite struck by this thing was completely out of place. How did it get there?
Yeah, they're just mystery piled on top of mystery, especially when you get into the missing 411 stuff, where children vanish. Sometimes they're found alive, but they're on the other side of a mountain range,
Yes.
15 miles away, and sometimes unscathed.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're scratched up a bit or maybe dehydrated, but and the things that are the incidents. Now, what we're talking about is he was a retired a police detective, and he was a Bigfoot researcher. I think he still is, but he was at a state park, and some people came to him, some of the park officials, and said, we've got a real mystery on our hands here. And they started talking about some of the bizarre disappearances that occur at these state parks. Well, since then, his research has expanded even into urban areas, but these are not. He's got a certain criteria. These are not people that obviously wanted to disappear from society or were murdered or whatever. These are really, really bizarre disappearances,
Yeah.
and the ones that are in a way, I mean, it's very disturbing when they find a dead body, especially when they find it in the same area where they've been searching.
That was the
But
commonality, wasn't it? There was these places were being checked over repeatedly, and no sign of
yep,
anything. All of a sudden, the body turns up. We think that's just not possible. I mean, there was a similar case that I know of that occurred. Now, like I say, it occurred. There's been some speculation it might not be as it was originally described, but I'll tell you the story that I know is again this Clapham Woods that I mentioned before, where we have our own investigation a number of years back. That the priest of the church that is on the edge of the wood was basically on holiday and had a locum in for a period of time while he was away. That locum priest disappeared and was never found. But the area of the wood was searched repeatedly, and no sign was found until some time later, when the body turned up in a place that had definitely been searched before. And it was in situ. It wasn't like it had been dumped there. It was clearly fallen there, or whatever. But it was a place that had been repeatedly looked before, but yet never found, and it was there. And so I know of a case here that. Again, I said there's been some speculation more recently that perhaps the story is more to the story than was being told, but that was very much the story that was told to me some years ago, that that's what happened with this body.
I've got a series of incidents that are connected that kind of bring us at least a partial circle around to some of the things we've been talking about. Alan Godfrey, a police officer from Todmorden, England, back about 1979 or 80. There was a body found in the train yard. Now this guy's last name was Adamski, no
Yes.
relation to George, as far as I know.
Yeah.
But you know the story I'm talking about, where the guy
Absolutely,
was
yeah.
a relative, his niece or something like that. He was excited about her wedding the next day or two, and he goes off to the grocery store. He disappears. They find him a week later. He's on top of this coal heap with no evidence that he crawled up there. There's no coal on him. He's missing his shirt. He's looking straight up, and he's got a look of terror on his face. So Godfrey is trying to understand. He's trying to get closure for the family, but eventually at some point he's told to back off, and he doesn't know why. Well, several months later, he gets out on a call looking for displaced cattle. These cattle have shown up behind a gated area over a little stream or whatever. There's no way they should have gotten into this locked gate. And he's called out there. At first he thinks it's a hoax. And the little old lady that called him out has said, I may be old, but I'm not crazy. And she also saw kind of a strange light, like a flash of light. And then later on, Godfrey finds out he's missing about a half hour of time. Eventually, he retrieves that, and it's a classic kind of abduction, which is very much has the trappings of fairy lore, because you have the one tall entity, looks kind of human in robes, called Yosef. The other ones Godfrey calls them little lads, and they're hideous. He can't look at them. They're so ugly he doesn't want to look at them. And he's under hypnosis. He's talking about what's on the ship. And what does he say? He says, there's a bloody dog in here, a large black dog, and it's hideous. and again, sort of maybe shades of the black shuck of folklore.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, no matter what you do, it's not that we try to force these things to have patterns, but no matter what you do, if you are alert, they're there. You see them, and you must follow them if we have any hope of unraveling any of this.
I'd say it comes back to that same notion again, that we are seeing things in accordance to our beliefs, that, modern man is a generic term of humans, our experience of otherness tends to be of the UFO variety now. We're taken into strange spaceships and poked about by aliens. Go back 100 years and you're talking about people taken underground and fairies and trolls and that kind of creature. Now, I've heard the argument put forward that what people were seeing 100 years ago weren't fairies and trolls, they were actually space aliens, were misidentified, but I don't believe that. I think they are, again, they are amorphous and they appear in the form that we understand of our time, because as we've talked before, I mean, I'm kind of slowly but surely compiling a book that is a collection of very, very strange folkloric type incidents, but first-hand descriptions of strange things happening, which it kind of parallels the book I wrote a few years back, which is a collection of spells and incantations from folklore times, from Victorian times and earlier. And as I was compiling and finding those, I was coming across these strange stories, and they don't talk about spaceships or objects in the sky. They talk about people appearing from nowhere or appearing to emerge from underground or from a hill. So, I think how we see these things now is always transitory. It's not set. It just depends on the time frame, the person, the people that we are, and what we believe or understand, or what fits us scientifically. Because I think UFOs, as in nuts and bolts spaceships from other planets, are so commonly talked about now, including obviously things like the Pentagon Papers seem to release videos of strange anomalies, that is almost like that's the standard description now. It's more acceptable to say these are aliens from other planets, because we have things like Star Wars and Star Trek that give you the idea of faster light travel being relatively simple and very easily done, quite achievable, which in fact is still, God, we couldn't begin to figure out how on earth that would be even possible. But because it's given to us almost daily by these kind of programs, these things kind of run in parallel, that it's quite possible, quite easy to travel faster than light. We're going to do it fairly soon, and other beings already found out how to do it and they're traveling to us. That's the narrative that's so kind of standard, that we tend to always go to that area. And as you've said before about people with cryptids, the idea is that the Bigfoot can only be a flesh and blood creature, and if you're a wacko if you think it's something different to that. Same with the UFO phenomenon. Predominantly people will say it is nuts and bolts spaceships, and you're a bit weird if you think it's more than that. But there's no reason that should be any, and I'm going to say this earlier, but there's no reason why other theories should be any more or less weird. They're just different theories, and I find that interesting. There's kind of a push to explain those things in that certain way. And going full circle back to the Skinwalker Ranch program, I like the fact that they haven't come with a strong preconceived notion of what's actually going on. They're observing and cataloging phenomena as it occurs and trying to understand the phenomena, rather than sort of make it fit into a certain criteria of what they think we're supposed to think these things are. They haven't come to it with a definite, it's definitely aliens on another planet, it's definitely portals, it's definitely ghosts. They're approaching it with the idea of, well, let's see what this data tells us. And that, I think, is a refreshing approach.
And it seems, for the most part, something happens and they discuss it and say, okay, that's leading us to this point, so let's dig here, or let's look into here. So they're using the scientific method. When certain things are revealed, they take the next step and see what they can. And also, they're not. I firmly believe that if you just look at it strictly as hard-nosed scientists, you're not going to do something like bring in a rabbi and do a ritual. You're not going to do maybe bring in remote viewers or something like that. Well, I've got to tell you, this is a little off to the side, but Jim Marrs wrote a book called Sci Spies, and of course we all know how the remote viewers were out to try and find bad guys and commies, right? Well, that was their main purpose. But every once in a while, they throw in something like I call it a straw man or a red herring, just something totally unrelated. But they're always blind targets. So they put in Nessie. And the remote viewers were getting something like a plesiosaur. Anyway, it seemed to be physical. It was making a wake through the water. But when they tried to find out its origin or where it came from, it disappeared.
Very strange.
And I wish I knew more about that. I'm gonna, there was a guy named Bill Ray was on with me and Mac Maloney on his show, and Bill Ray was one of the original remote viewers. It was taught by Ingo Swann. Ingo Swann was the guy that developed the protocols for the military remote viewing program, and Bill Ray trained some of the most famous ones. But he told me that he had. They did once in a while give him some really wild targets, and that stuff is just absolutely fascinating to me. And the one thing I forgot to mention was back to the missing 411 stuff. The experiences that really creep me out are when the person survives and comes back. Sometimes it's a child that can barely explain what happened, but sometimes it's an adult that is very confused and befuddled and can't really tell you what happened to them during their missing 3 days or whatever it was.
Yes, that is the fascination of. It's almost as if you can't find the words to describe what they experience. You've had it, but you can't describe it. It's just fascinating that something happens. Clearly, something happens. I mean, okay, probably there are some people who just make it up because it's publicity, it's fame, and might lead to a bit of money somehow. But when you hear these reports of people who don't really want that kind of publicity, don't want to be involved, but yet their experience means they have no choice but to be involved to try and understand what they've experienced. I don't know. I kind of, again, leaning back to that notion of they're going somewhere, but maybe not to a fully physical place. That their physical body obviously has to travel with them, if you like, but somehow it's not doing anything, and the mind's having more reaction. Because I say that notion of, for us observing strange phenomena, where we're saying something like Skinwalker Ranch, and actually seeing this weird stuff happening, we see strange stuff. But if stuff's coming from their reality into this reality, ours, then the other way is obviously going to happen. And these 411 disappearance types could be them going the other way and then coming back to us. But because it's just, you can't describe it because it doesn't have a frame of reference that you can work with. I mean, it always takes you back to that thing we talked before about the idea of the American natives not being able to see the ships that Columbus and co were sailing in. Because it was so outside their understanding that the mind just couldn't comprehend it. So it blanked it out. These people appeared on small boats and landed from nowhere, so it seems, for them, because they didn't have the frame of reference of the large, tall sailing ships. So people perhaps who have somehow flipped over to this other realities, because there's probably more than one, they can't comprehend what they're observing, can't explain it to us. I know human psychology, of course, being a psychotherapist, that all our explanations of what we're observing is always reference to what we already know and understand. That's how we build our understanding of the world, in reference to what we already know. And if something's so far outside that, you can't comprehend it because you have no frame of reference with which to work. So they may be having those experiences that they can almost visualize mentally but can't describe because there's no frame of reference that they have, that we almost don't have the language to explain what we've experienced. Those people who've had those kinds of experiences.
Also, there even Politis in one of his the preface, I think, to one of his books, recognizes the connection between some of the missing 411, the criteria where people vanish, and fairy lore. Picking berries is one. Boulder fields is another. Dogs were afraid of the fairies. Dogs won't track sometimes when people disappear. It's just, again, you can connect fairy lore to obviously some modern day UFO experiences and even some of the missing 411 incidents. There was a one incident in I try to remember the book. Was it The Middle Kingdom? And the author, it was his aunt was being taken care of by a young girl. She was a caretaker, and this is in Ireland. And she took off, and she had some free time, so she went to this one area that was known as a fairy hill or a fairy mound. Well, as she started to walk back down it, she found she was walking back up it. And every time she turned around to go back down, and it was almost like she was trapped. And then she came to something that was like this is back in the 1930s. So not using the same terms, but it was kind of like an invisible force field. So late at night, 3 in the morning, they're out there with torches looking for her, and she's screaming at the top of her lungs and can't be heard. And then finally, whatever it is, the force field, the wall evaporates, and she makes her way home. That just made me think, very eerily of the missing 411 stuff. I wonder if some of those people that have vanished were in a situation like that, but then they were never found again. I don't know. Very, very interesting experience.
Yeah, you can imagine almost standing on the other side of this invisible barrier saying, "Hey, I'm here. Can't you see me?" That's kind of, I can imagine how bizarre that experience that would be. The idea that you're there, but they can't see you, but you can see them. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen the Harry Potter movies. There's a scene there in which the three heroes are on the run from the baddies, and they're basically in a wood, and Hermione creates this kind of barrier thing around them that they can't be seen within. And there's a scene where the pursuers are standing very close to her, but they can't see her, and it's that kind of, that's where the ideas come from. That notion of, I mean, I can't think off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are cases out there where people have had that kind of experience where they're there, people can't see them, but they're there, and they sort of shouting, "Can you see me?" I'm sure there's cases of that out there somewhere. So that kind of thing is going on, almost as if you're phasing across into the other realities, but haven't quite got there yet. You're still half sort of caught within this reality.
Well, do you think we should start to wind down, and maybe I don't know that we can sum up? I didn't know when we started out, we talked about starting with the Skinwalker Ranch, and of course we branched off into other areas that kind of connect. But that's pretty much the substance of the show, because it's just a fascinating area that one of these high strangeness areas, similar to others like the Bradshaw Ranch, the Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the Marley Woods, and on and on. And I guess what did Cannock Chase considered a hot spot?
Well, Cannock Chase, I have a certain bugbear with that place that I don't want to go into. It's not really fair, but there's a person who I know back in the early 2000s who was very heavily promoting that area, and all the strange stuff seemed to happen to this one particular person who used to write about it a lot. Then other people, of course, subsequent to that, have had similar kind of strange experiences. So I'm always a little dubious with Cannock Chase. I do think it might be the rather brilliant workings of one individual to create this sense there's a weirdness there. And of course, when you go to a place expecting weirdness tends to occur. The one I would say probably that gets a little overlooked over here, but I do think has significance in that respect, is a place called Nymphsfield, which is in Gloucestershire. Field of Nymphs, or as we were talking about, sort of fairy folk again. And the place called Woodchester Mansion, which I've talked about many times, is in Nymphsfield, and that is notoriously very strange place, very haunted, and lots of very odd things have happened, not only to there, but there was a building on the same site previous to that seems to be of a connection, that somehow the building itself seems to the old building seems to manifest into our reality sometimes there as well, because some of the phenomena that's been described fits in with the previous building rather than the one that's there now. So for me, that's a place of high strangeness. It's had sort of ghostly reports and weird sightings in the valley, the Nymphsfield Valley that it's in. So that's one. Clapham Wood, quite possibly. Again, there's some question about the validity of some of the stories told about Clapham Wood, but it does seem to be a place of high strangeness over here. This is on the south coast, or close to the south coast, where a number of strange things have occurred. So there are some definite sites over here. And I've often wondered things like stone circles, like Stonehenge, for example, or stone markers. They are there because strange things have happened there, and these markers, if you like, denote the strangeness has occurred there, the sightings and things happen over the millennia. That's why these get built on these particular places. I mean, often they are things like Stonehenge is like an astrological a point. I mean, it points to the sunrise on the winter solstice, summer solstice, etc. So it's got an astronomical feature to it, but the very fact they're on those particular sites, why they're there and not other places, I think because strange phenomena has occurred there, and the natives have observed that phenomena.
What about Warminster?
Again, interesting place. Funny enough, Well, I regularly visit Glastonbury in Somerset, which again, Glastonbury could be considered to be one of those sites, but then it's kind of a magnet for strange people like me anyway, so it's full of strange people. But we often drive past Warminster. Never stopped yet. We sometimes think I should stop there, but we usually want to get home, so we don't tend to stop. But I've been through a few times, and I know the history of strangeness, the particular incident that occurred, which is very odd. This object is almost at roof height going past, flying over one Christmas. Again, the standard explanation is it's some kind of low-flying UFO, but for those who were first-hand witnesses, it did all sorts of strange things that an ordinary, if you like, UFO spaceship wouldn't necessarily be able to do. Sounding more like some kind of being or creature was flying over them. So, yeah, I mean, I do think we do have definite spots here as well that fit that high strangeness effect.
I love reading Arthur Shuttlewood's books on Warminster. And
Oh, yeah.
back then, the locals just called it the Thing. I think sometimes they would hear noises like I don't know, sonic booms or something, or some kind of a loud thunderclap. Anyway, there was noise, anomalous noises, along with all the strange lights and so forth.
See, that kind of fits that thing we said before about the sudden bangs and clicks and cracks, and then as things occur, like it's the splitting of reality, if you like, as it opens up, creates a light or a sound, and then these things occur.
And car door slamming and metal on metal sometimes,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. Even even Betty and Barney Hill is tenuously connected to Bigfoot. There was Betty owned some property. Her niece and nephew camped on it. It was kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and they were hearing a bunch of activity, and didn't really see much of anything. But they heard things like a car door slam in the middle of nowhere and metal on metal. And then the next day they found a strange footprint, not quite a classic Bigfoot footprint, but more of a three-toed variety, like Stan Gordon was finding in Pennsylvania in 73 and 74. So, and there was another incident where Betty was with one of her friends, I forget the name, but they were somewhere near the area where Betty's parents lived. It wasn't quite as congested, I don't think, as where Betty and Barney Hill lived. And there was some kind of commotion in the woods, and her friend said, "Oh, don't worry, that's just Bigfoot. He's been here before." And she shows, and later on, she shows Betty a beautiful plaster cast of a Bigfoot print. So you can't get, nobody who would think that Betty and Barney Hill, I mean, they are kind of connected to folklore a little bit too, and all the strange stuff that went on afterwards. But who would have thought that you could possibly connect Bigfoot to Betty and Barney Hill?
Well, that shows the connections exist. I think it comes back again to what we said before about the fact that people don't tend to have one isolated experience. Once one's happened, others seem to follow.
Well, with that, Andy, I think perhaps we should wrap up the program.
Sure. I have a couple of quick announcements to make that I think
absolutely.
Our listeners would be interested in. First and foremost, I have reinstigated, that's completely the wrong word. I have restarted our own YouTube channel. High Strangeness Factor now has its own YouTube present independently of the Paranormal UK Radio network. The reason for that is partly because it is now quite a large network. We have about a dozen shows that go out and onto YouTube a week. So sometimes finding our show, yours and ours, isn't so easy. So I thought rather than people having to keep trawling through that, I've started again uploading some of our shows to our own YouTube channel. So it's called the High Strangeness Factor. It should be fairly easy to find under that name. And hopefully going to at least have one new one a week. Obviously, we've got quite a back catalogue to get through, as we do show once a fortnight, and eventually run out of shows if I'm doing once a week. But that's the aim, so they're much easier to find. I mean, initially the channel will just be repeats of our shows, but maybe we'll upload some stuff onto that is not available anywhere else, just to make it a bit more interesting. So that's worth looking out for. If you look for the High Strangeness Factor on YouTube, you should find us if you Google that name. I'm also working, as you know, on my own channel, which is a little different. It's more of a looking at particular live particular clips of supposed paranormal activity. There's a lot of channels do these things like they call the top 5 ghosts caught on camera, that kind of thing. It's a bit like that, but I'm going to try and go into a little bit more detail as to what might be going on in the clip. You know, perhaps being a little more skeptical than some of these are, but I always say very much I'm not trying to tell you what to believe or not believe. I just present what I find. But some of them, you know, I am left thinking, no, I can't explain this. This is something going on. This is paranormal. Sometimes I might be like, I can see a possible explanation here, but you figure it out for yourself. That should be launching finally around Halloween this year. And I've been going on about this probably for about 2 years, I must admit. But I finally want to get the damn thing up and running at last. So that's something that I will probably talk about maybe once or twice more before Halloween arrives, and then hopefully again that's going to be one upload a week is the plan. I've got quite a big back catalogue of those already made, so I've got enough to keep me going probably till next summer at the moment. But that's something that I've been working on for a while and will finally be launching fairly soon. So. Yeah.
Sounds good. And also, unfortunately, the Mothman Festival was canceled this year, but the following weekend, the Van Meter Visitor Festival in Van Meter, Iowa, just west of Des Moines, which commemorates the Week of Terror, where they saw a strange winged creature back in 1903. As of now, that's still on, and I will be speaking there on the Shaver Mystery. And then the following weekend, the first weekend in October, is the Bray Road Conference. Bray Road in Elkhorn is the home of the mysterious Dogman. And I will be speaking about various cryptids and the high strangeness aspects of them. So we'll see how the audience response has been to a guestless show.
Yeah, lots of negative comments. Who are these fools? Get the real guests back.
Well, I had a lot of fun with it. It was, we could talk about the Skinwalker Ranch endlessly, and everything I've heard is there is going to be a 3rd season, so that's something to look forward to.
Absolutely.
Okay, I will close this out. The High Strangeness Factor was created by Steve Ward and Andy Mercer and is copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I want to thank our fearless leaders, Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson, here at the network. I also want to thank Andy Mercer in his dual role as producer and regular co-host, and also Brian Zeller for composing the High Strangeness Factor theme music. I can be heard weekly as a correspondent on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files that can be found on this same network. You can also check out my Facebook page called The Phantom Menagerie. And I am Steve Ward, your humble host here on the High Strangeness Factor, a displaced Yank on Paranormal UK Radio Network. Thank you for listening. I will see you all again in a fortnight. Take care.